Hi, Krista. Thank you for joining us today. I don't have a podcast name, but thank you for joining the channel. I wanted to invite you on. I know we met at SF Climate Week back in the summer. Basically, I went into Climate Week thinking there's a couple things that I really don't know enough about that I really want to learn more about. And one of them is about mineral extraction. Your work with human rights and mineral extraction in that long list of what often can feel very focused on sort of the corporate side of energy. Was really refreshing. So I made sure that I went and saw your talk, and that was one of my favorite parts of Climate Week. So please introduce yourself and what you do at CRI.
Yeah, thanks so much, Heidi. No, it's wonderful to speak with you, and thanks again for coming back at SF Climate Week. It was great to have lots of people from different backgrounds there. But so my name's Krista Shennum, and I'm a researcher at Climate Rights International, CRI. And so what CRI is we're a nonprofit organization that does research and advocacy around the intersection of human rights and climate change. And so in some ways, sometimes that's the drivers of the climate crisis, like fossil fuels and deforestation. In some capacity, that's solutions, including minerals and solar panels and the materials we need to transition away from fossil fuels, as well as the human rights impacts of climate change itself, like extreme heat. And so we do research, we document human rights abuses through in-depth field reporting and report writing, as well as advocacy. So we push governments and companies to be held accountable for abuses and justice for local communities. And so a lot of my work with CRI is focused on transition minerals, particularly on nickel in Southeast Asia. And so in the last 3 years. CRI is a pretty new organization, launched just about 3 years ago. And so in the last 3 years, we've now released 3 reports on the nickel industry in Indonesia. It's the world's largest producer of nickel. And then just last month in November, we released a report documenting human rights and environmental impacts of the Philippines nickel mining industry. And so together, Indonesia and the Philippines provide over, roughly 2/3 of the world's nickel. So it's pretty representative of much of the nickel that's being used in EV batteries and other kind of renewables and other uses.
I think this is a good time to pull up some stats that were shocking to me about your reports. I mean, I had no idea that how big of an impact nickel mining is and how big it's going to become. Yeah, in your paper or in your reports, you were citing that the projections show that there's a 61% increase of nickel by 2040. I was really shocked, actually. Probably the most shocked to see that in your case study about Indonesia that they have so much coal capacity, or that they're building just to extract nickel for electric vehicles for this clean energy transition. And then it's sort of ironic because it's such a massive amount of coal. Yeah, can you talk more about about the sort of, I guess, the ironies of how these mining operations are contributing to environmental destruction?
First and foremost, it's always important when we talk about impacts of minerals to also acknowledge that we absolutely have to stop burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels and the climate crisis is a huge contributor to human rights abuses around the world and has tremendous impacts, on people and the environment. But that being said, the urge to transition away from fossil fuels into renewables is not an excuse for human rights abuses and increased carbon emissions, which is what we're seeing in places like Indonesia. So one of the things that's unique about Indonesia as a minor producer of nickel is that it processes everything that is mined domestically. So a few years ago, essentially the country banned the export of raw ore, and so in a lot of ways, this is meant to build up the domestic economy. But one of the consequences is that where a lot of these processing facilities exist in parts of East Indonesia, including Sulawesi and North Maluku, are not connected to an electricity grid. The country is also really rich in coal. And so what we've seen is that there's been a massive build out of captive coal plants to power the processing of nickel in Indonesia. And so, these captive coal plants provide no electricity to local communities. They're directly powering industrial activities. So currently there's about 18 gigawatts of captive coal exclusively for nickel, either already in operation or in the pipeline. This 18 gigawatts is roughly compared to all of the coal that's burned in both Thailand and the Philippines combined. So it's an a massive amount of
That's
emissions.
huge,
And these
yeah.
are also emissions that are just not reported. There's not national emissions reporting requirements in Indonesia for these captive coal plants. So that means, all of these global efforts of the stock take and to actually understand how much we're emitting are not included in this incredible category. And like you said, and like I said, these captive coal plants are only used for nickel. They're not used for anything else. And so, without the boom and demand for nickel, these coal plants otherwise would not exist. Um, Broadly in the tropics, the way that nickel is mined is through open pit mining, which also has tremendous impacts on the environment, includes significant amounts of deforestation, destruction of mangroves. So you're not just looking at the burning of fossil fuels to process it, but also the destruction of natural carbon sinks and other reserves.
And I think a lot of times for these infrastructure projects, the people who are sort of pro uh, extraction try to say, "Oh, we're gonna give people jobs," and "Oh, like look at these people that are doing basic things like fishing. We're gonna help upskill them and teach them industrial skills and give them more corporate jobs and skills." But in your reports, you're showing so much of how people's livelihoods are completely being made impossible because of the environmental destruction, and that those jobs that they do provide are not actually giving people opportunities. Yeah, could you speak more to that?
So in the report that we just released in the Philippines, it's called Broken Promises, and this is a direct quote from many people that I spoke with who, told me that when the industry arrived, they had been promised good jobs and sustainable development and a better quality of life, and largely people feel like those promises have been broken. In many communities, near nickel mining in the Caraga region. So this is in southern Philippines, in the northern part of the island of Mindanao. People have been traditionally fishing and farming, whether it's farming rice and other crops and fishing as a way to sustain themselves and their families. And this, like kind of traditional livelihoods have been enough to, send their children to college and like have a nice standard of living. And so what people have found is that, these, traditional livelihoods have been completely destroyed by pollution from, nearby nickel mining, that you have, siltation. So a lot of sediment coming from mining areas that, is choking rivers. So whenever you have rain events, the rivers are much more shallow. So you have sediment from the mines that's just choking rice fields entirely. You have fisheries that are essentially dead because of the significant marine pollution, so both the marine environment but also freshwater. And so people are struggling not only to support themselves but also even having enough food to eat. In some cases, people work in the mining industry. In the Philippines, they also take a few month-long period of rest for rainy period, just because it's so dangerous to mine during the rainiest parts of the year. But that essentially leaves people with 4 months of the year where they have no income because there's no mining jobs. They don't have any sort of like social benefits from the mining companies to cover their pay during those off season. And then the fishing and the farming has been severely impacted. So currently right now in December is the rainy season. And so right now people are particularly struggling, with this impact.
Uh, I'm wondering, like, why is it that there are these, yeah, that so many mining operations tend to have human rights abuses?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of been the, MO of extractive industries for generations. For hundreds of years, extractive industries have been extractive of the environment and extractive of people. Mining always is going to have some environmental harm, when you're digging up the earth. And I think part of it is that, these are big cash industries and they move really quickly. And part of it is just a governance issue. There's around the world, there's always, often conflict with extractive industries, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's fossil fuels, whether it's, mining for minerals like nickel. But, a lot of these, particularly these human rights impacts on people's livelihoods, access to clean drinking water, right to a healthy environment and health impacts are things that are, quite avoidable. And so, what we see often with kind of extraction and consumption on a global level, where you have, say, communities in the global north, in the U.S. and Europe, that are, consuming a lot of minerals, are also exporting the harms. These
Mm-hmm.
mines are not, there's mines, of course, in the U.S. and in Europe, but predominantly we're seeing these like most severe impacts in human rights abuses in place where you have weaker governance and weaker, either laws on the books or enforcement of those laws and regulations. Some of the harms that we've documented in both Indonesia and the Philippines are also like pretty specific to those places. So, for example, in Indonesia, we've also documented cases where military and police force are used on behalf of private companies to intimidate communities into selling lands. While in the Philippines, we've also documented how mining is making people even more vulnerable to the climate crisis. So the Philippines is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, and we're seeing that the destruction of mangroves, this increased pollution is actually making these major climate events, these super typhoons that are happening even more and more often, even more devastating and damaging for local communities.
Ironically, it's because of the, I guess, global north countries that are looking for this EV powered future and like working towards solving climate change. And like we feel good when we buy an EV because, over here we're like, oh, it's going to be better for the planet. I'm doing my part. And of course, we're not seeing what's happening all the way down in the supply chain. So can you speak to like how much of what we're seeing in the nickel industry is because of transitioning to clean energy and electric vehicles?
So essentially, all of the demand for new nickel is largely driven by batteries, and so most of that is batteries for electric vehicles. In some cases, also broadly like batteries for energy storage. But the other like primary uses for nickel, including for the production of stainless steel, have pretty like stable markets. So all this demand for new nickel mines and new nickel processing facilities is largely driven by electric vehicles. So I think it's like 39 kilograms of nickel in the average EV. So that's like almost 80 pounds.
Yeah.
In a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle, essentially has no nickel whatsoever. And so it's a huge absolute like use of nickel. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think, and another kind of key piece with this is that, nickel is infinitely recyclable. So, so is often many other minerals, lithium and cobalt, you can keep reusing and recycling them. And so I think this piece is why it's, even more critical that, this push to secure minerals for the energy transition is done in a rights respecting way. There's absolutely the concern that if, processes around circularity and reusing and repurposing materials doesn't actually happen, that you would continue having, these same cycles of abuses like we've seen for, decades with fossil fuels and other extractives. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, it's a really key moment to making sure that we get it right. Of course, like I said, we urgently have to stop burning fossil fuels, but, building new coal plants in Indonesia, removing indigenous peoples of their lands, and, essentially starving children, taking away, the local food sources and water sources for local communities is also not a climate solution.
Yeah, I think this just really speaks to the complexity of the challenges that come with moving us away into a more electrified future. It's like I would argue that we probably don't need as many electric vehicles if we had better public transportation infrastructure and we moved people in bigger vehicles that are on rails and run by electric, right? And maybe some people don't think about it that way, but biking obviously is still better, and even electric vehicles have like as much polymers and plastics as
Sure.
right as like an internal combustion engine vehicle, whether or not it's powered by with a battery. But one of the recommendations you have in your reports are that the electric vehicle companies also have a responsibility to not procure metals and nickel specifically from supply chains that contain these conflict minerals or minerals that have human rights abuses around them. My understanding of supply chains are really complicated because you have so many layers and often they're opaque from each other, since you have like ore and you have smelting and processing and then it's put into like a thing, right? And like you're buying components that you have no idea where they're coming from. But yeah, how does that actually work? Can supply chain managers see all the way down to where the ore comes from?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I would say that regardless of whether or not they currently are doing that, they have obligations to do so. So under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, it puts companies, on the hook for human rights abuses in their operations, and often that also includes in their supply chain. There's a few countries that have like pretty progressive or more progressive, at least, supply chain laws on the books. So, for example, in Germany, every large company in Germany, even if they're not headquartered there, but if they have enough employees there, are obligated under the German supply chain due diligence law that essentially puts them on hook for human rights abuses in their entire supply chains. So that means like a large German auto company, if they're using nickel from Indonesia that's contributing to human rights abuses, that there can be a complaint made against that German company because of those abuses, even though it's not that German car company themselves that are the ones perpetuating those abuses, but they are implicated. Um, Really, the way that the supply chain works is that, like you said, there's the mining companies, there's the mineral processing companies, the battery manufacturers, and then maybe the EV companies. And so that's a very like reductive way of the supply chain. There's lots of trading happening, and essentially like some companies have a really great sense of their supply chain, and some companies, for example Tesla, also discloses here's companies that we're sourcing from. In Indonesia, we get nickel from this company and this company. We get cobalt from this company and this company in the DRC. I think it's a really key moment, and also it's concerning if companies don't understand their supply chain. It puts them at great risks, both from like a business, financial, economic perspective, but also like from a human rights perspective. If they are perpetuating abuses in their supply chain, if they're sourcing minerals using that are powered through coal, that's not in line with the mandate of many of us, particularly like the EV only companies. And so, one thing that, we've really been pushing electric vehicle companies and battery companies on is, first of all, like mapping their supply chain entirely and making that information transparent. It's really difficult for local communities to hold companies accountable where they don't know where the minerals are going. And, the environment often is quite challenging at a local level, where maybe the local companies are involved in intimidating people or harassing, criminalizing people, where you have local officials at the local level, at the national level, that have vested interests in industry. So it's difficult to hold them accountable for an industry if they're financially benefiting, or they're making rules based on, if it's helping them personally, and as well as, their investments. And so, having a clear link and understanding where these minerals are going is also like quite important for local communities. And so, yeah, I think there's companies that are farther ahead than others, but it's really a key moment, and kind of no excuse rather than to get it right. I think a lot of companies are aware of this, and they're also like quite concerned. So we've seen, for example, after our reporting policy changes by companies, a lot of companies do have these like really beautiful supplier codes of conduct on the books as well. So things that say like our suppliers will respect Indigenous peoples' rights and ensure that Indigenous peoples can, provide free, prior, informed consent, or that, it's not polluting the water and that labor rights are respected. But it's not always clear how these policies are actually enforced, particularly beyond, the tier one supplier. So the person there or the company they're directly buying the battery from. And so really, seeing how that like chain of custody, even though it's currently cloudy, that essentially enables many of these abuses to occur. So it is, really, these EV companies have an important role to play in actually ensuring that they are being transparent, and making even just very basic information publicly available and accessible to communities.
And I think the demographic of their customer base, like largely folks who are, yeah, wanting to buy EVs willingly, it's not something people would want in those vehicles, right? They're so
Exactly. Yeah.
antithetical, yeah,
Yeah.
to like the
Totally.
the values of somebody who wants to buy an EV. So, I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, good.
No, they have a lot to lose if they don't get it right. At the end of the day, if people think, actually, I'm not going to buy an EV anymore because it feels just as bad for the environment as, continuing to drive my old like car that I've been driving for 20 years, then like that's not a good thing for companies either. It's not a good thing for the climate either. It's still like generally like lower life cycle emissions to drive an EV, but if you're having, these serious human rights abuses, like, people don't want to be implicated in that. And at the end of the day, these are consumer facing companies when you're talking about auto companies and EV companies is, they're consumer, when you're buying a $30,000, $40,000 vehicle, it's probably, one of the biggest lifetime purchases that most people make. And so people are likely not going to continue to push for that if they're concerned of these human rights abuses and the environmental impacts. And so, I think the customer base and people who are driving these vehicles also, should be really aware that this is the impact, but also that, this doesn't have to be the impact. There are very real things that both EV companies can do, the mining companies, the processing companies, and the local governments, whether it's the Indonesian government, the Filipino government, or any other mineral producing government in the world can do to ensure that the rights of local communities and the environment is respected.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see that in the Philippines how you have examples of like action being taken by the government and then that action being reversed depending on who's the president and what kind of politics or I guess are involved. So I mean, I feel like sometimes people think the clean energy, like things about clean energy are very straightforward, but they're so connected to policies and politics and yeah, I was happy to hear that there was action taken, and there has been action taken by government leaders in the past.
In each of these reports, we have, 10 pages of recommendations to different government ministries at kind of a national level, at a local level, to different types of companies. And, some of them are like pretty big asks and recommendations. For example, decarbonizing from captive coal is not something that, companies can do tomorrow necessarily, but, making a time-bound timeline and roadmap in order to do this so is something. But there are things that like companies really could do tomorrow that would actually have a huge impact for local communities. So, for example, in Indonesia, companies are required to, take air and water quality samples that they provide to the government. But then that information and that data is never made publicly available. So, companies could publish that. They could say, here's the data. Actually, your water is safe to drink. And maybe communities would trust that. Maybe they wouldn't. But without any basic information, people are left, making decisions like, do I drink this water based on how brown it's looking today and not actually any indicator whether there's toxins, heavy metals that could harm themselves, their families. And so just like basic access to information, which is hypothetically there, could be, really done quite quickly and have a huge impact on local peoples.
What are the goals of your work at CRI?
Yeah, really. I mean, I think it's twofold. One of them is, since we're a human rights and a climate organization, so part of it is around addressing the climate crisis. That's including, preventing future emissions. So, we've done work on fossil fuel projects like the East Africa crude oil pipeline and the Kingfisher branch. So this is one of the world's largest heated oil pipelines in East Africa that goes through Uganda. But also ensuring that, through, understanding that whether it's through the solutions of the climate crisis or impacts, that human rights are respected. So broadly, addressing climate change and human rights together. So understanding that these are not separate things. For the last 30 something years in the global climate agenda, the climate has been an entirely separate thing from people. And we've seen polar bears and kind of charismatic megafauna as like the icon of climate change for decades. And we've also seen very little meaningful action taken to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. I think in the last 5 years or so, as a world, we're like seeing these severe weather, severe extreme weather events happening more and more frequently. I live in Los Angeles, and I have many friends and who lost their homes earlier this year to some pretty unseasonably massive wildfires. In Indonesia, hundreds of people were just a couple weeks ago, displaced with major flooding events. The Philippines was just hit back to back with two typhoons in the course of a week in early November. So, as the impacts of climate change are increasing, people are understanding more and more that it's not an environmental issue, but it is a human rights issue. And so, our goal as an organization is, both preventing the worst impacts of climate change, but also ensuring that human rights are respected along the way.
I asked you because I feel like one of the things that your work does is surface stories that may otherwise be easy to be tucked away, that like people maybe in the UN, like I saw that the quote somebody said that I hope this story gets all the way up to the UN and people need to know about this. And as a communications person, I feel like just sharing that something is happening is a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the way that, we do research is that we interview people who are directly impacted. So we'll go to local communities and villages, say near nickel mines, for example, that, are directly impacted. Their quality of life is suffered, their livelihoods are destroyed, their access to food and water, their pollution in their areas, harming their health. And so, I think by describing the impacts in people's own voices is really important and powerful. So throughout reports, it's very heavy on including testimony of people themselves, included in their own words. It's not just a international organization that's going to visit people and saying what they think is happening, but this is really, the harms that are talked about in people's own words. We also, often try to produce videos and other kind of more, dynamic product, research products than just, these very long reports, which can be pretty hard to get through sometimes. And so, for example, we just put out a really nice video. It's like about 8 minutes long, um, alongside our Philippines report that includes, some of the local community members themselves, local activists, members of the church, who really talk about, the impacts it has on their lives in their own words. And so I think, always going to local communities as being like the first and foremost experts.
How did you get into this work? Because I like to talk to people about the different types of climate work that are out there and encourage people to shift into a climate job. How did you get your climate job?
So I've kind of been in the environmental space for some time. So my undergrad, I studied environmental science and international studies, and did some kind of random jobs, kind of environmental education and conservation work. But really, I would say the main thing that started pivoting me towards this direction is I worked for an organization for a few years in Oregon called the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide. And so it provided legal scientific support to grassroots environmental lawyers around the world. And so through that, I got to meet a lot of, these really interesting, inspiring, human rights lawyers who accidentally started working on environmental issues. They were defending a community against a port project or development project, and through a human rights lens, entered the environmental space. And it was just like a really interesting way to me to think about how do we actually, advance environmental and climate justice. I think at the same time, I was seeing that a lot of this, the kind of global climate movement and environmental justice movement either was completely dismissed as being,
Mm-hmm.
too idealistic, and
Yeah.
particularly when you think about environmental justice, climate justice, or was just really focused on the parts per million and emissions and these things that like were really separate from the impacts on communities and on people, which is something that's really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really kind of pivoted towards the human rights field because of that. So I got my master's in environmental management from the Yale School of Environment, and did some different internships. And really kind of the key thing was, leaving Yale, I had a fellowship to work with Human Rights Watch for a little over a year. So I worked with their environment program and did research documenting human rights abuses related to plastic recycling and the global plastic waste trade, focusing on Turkey, which is the number one recipient of plastic waste from the European Union. And so really, I think, human rights as a general like framework, sometimes it's kind of like the bare minimum, like saying people should have access to clean water and health and food and housing and freedom of expression. Like these are maybe for me like not my entire vision of like what a total just equitable future would look like, but the reality is that many people don't have these very basic rights honored and respected. The other part is that governments have legal obligations to upholding human rights. I would in within advocacy, when I was just doing straight environmental work, sometimes I would feel dismissed that people said like, that's great, but we don't really care about the environmental impact, or oh, the market will fix that eventually. And at the end of the day, with human rights, there are legal principles and obligations that governments and companies have. And so it provides an entry point for really meaningful action for communities and for impacted peoples, to really demand that the climate crisis is taken seriously, that it's not just a crisis for current generations but also for future generations, and that rights are really upheld.
I always say that like it's possible to solve climate change and do harm, and I think that is a principle that is shocking to people. And I feel that in the clean tech industry, there's a lot of there's a feeling of like, oh, I'm solving climate change because so then it inherently is good. But then like in my experience working in the climate tech industry, seeing that like large infrastructure projects again and again happen in areas where people don't want them, or people are like indigenous people don't want them, or communities around them have like not given enough information, and people have questions. And even if it is something that could be part of the clean energy transition, and that powers of capitalism and the forces that be push these companies to move faster than the pace of like human consent, making sure that people are not going to be harmed in the process of doing this. That's why I started working on community benefits work. That kind of role doesn't exist in a lot of organizations, and I kind of feel like I had to basically pitch that as a role. I think it's really important for folks like you to be calling this out, and for people like in this audience to learn about it, because my belief is that the public pressure would push companies to care more about those communities, because and I do a lot of data center stuff now, so like we're seeing a lot of pushback from communities, and public awareness can push those companies who say that they're doing good for the climate to actually do that, slow down, and put those principles into action.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like first step of like talking to communities is like so important. Before projects happen, and then often like you can address harms before they happen. So ideally you're doing environmental impact assessments and consultations where people like totally understand what's going on, with this project and what's the impact going to be, and also so the community, like the companies themselves, can understand. Okay, like I'm setting up this project in a water scarce area, and people are really concerned about access to water, so it's really important as I'm designing this project that that's something I keep in mind, and that I'm able to design this project in a way that's not going to make all the local communities really scared, unhappy. It has a huge long-term benefit. In Indonesia we see this also with mining, where sometimes these mines are permitted on indigenous people's customary lands that are not recognized by the government. And so, essentially like a government's failure to recognize indigenous people's lands and instead grant them to mining companies leads to direct conflict between indigenous groups and mining companies. The mining company says, "Oh, I got this permit, I'm able to mine, all good." But the reality is like they didn't consult the local communities. They didn't do their homework. They could have, even though there's, a culpability of like a government in this case, but also like the companies themselves could also be doing more. And so it's the same thing with these data center projects where they're using tons of electricity, and now communities are really against them. If they had consulted with the communities and really showed up and listened to people's concerns and addressed them, that a lot of these harms could be prevented.
Yeah, I mean, even just basically asking people or introducing yourself in a way that's not aggressive is like can go a long way, probably, right? I want to circle back to your work in Turkey and plastics recycling. Yeah, would love to hear more about what you did with the Human Rights Watch.
So, I mean, I think that, when we think about recycling often, say in the US, is like I took a plastic water bottle and I put it in the bin and like I recycled. But actually, like how recycling works is like once, materials are sorted, then for plastics, for example, you have like different numbers. So if you like look at the little triangle, that actually doesn't mean that anything is actually recyclable. But it has a number in it, and it essentially says like this is HDPE, high density polyethylene, or LDPE, low density polyethylene, or a different type of plastic. Generally, like plastic waste is exported. So for decades, most of plastic waste for the entire world was exported to China. But I think about 7 or 8 years ago now, China had a policy, a national soy policy, that essentially stopped the import of plastic waste because of the environmental and health impacts. And so really what we've seen is, in the last 7 or so years, global north countries and governments, are still consuming as much plastic as ever, for the most part, and it needs somewhere to go. And so we've seen that, there's different countries that have started to accept plastic waste and then to recycle it. And so what that like actual recycling process looks like generally is that, once it's sorted, it's shredded and then melted and reformed into plastic pellets. So toxic, plastics are inherently very toxic. There's lots of very toxic chemicals that are additives in plastics that give them characteristics. So whether that's specific colors or the malleability, things like that. But when you like heat plastic, it often is releasing a lot of those toxic chemicals. Like if you've ever accidentally like burned plastic on a campfire or on your kitchen stove, like that super pungent smell. And so, what we did for this report with Human Rights Watch, it's called "It's as if they're poisoning us," which is again a quote from a woman who I interviewed. We visited community members who are living next to these very small informal plastic recycling facilities, as well as many of the workers themselves, and documented very serious health impacts. So people who are living in dangerous proximity to very dangerous facilities where plastic was being melted and recycled. The fumes in these places are just like absolutely unbearable. And we also found that many of the people who are working in these facilities, which are often, unpermitted and not very well inspected, were people who are particularly vulnerable. So, undocumented migrants, including, young Afghan boys who had, fled to Turkey after the Taliban had took over, to, Syrian refugees and children. So that we documented many cases of child labor, in these really toxic facilities. Turkey is the largest importer of plastic waste from the European Union. So, this is, a local issue, both, in the communities themselves and at a national level, but also, this is a global issue as well. So, when people are recycling, it's kind of the same thing that we're talking about with EVs. You think you're doing a good thing, but if actually what you're doing is you're causing harms, your consumption of plastic is actually making it so that a child refugee is being exposed to serious toxic pollutants that is not only having short-term impacts on their health, including trouble breathing and rashes, but many of the chemicals, BPA and phthalates that are in plastics are also have really significant and lifelong health impacts, including are linked to cancers and reproductive system harms. And so as part of this research, in advocacy, we also did a lot of advocacy pushing the European Union to address its policy around where it's exporting plastic waste. And so, this story in Turkey is also, a similar story in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, where communities are burdened with, monumental amounts of plastic waste that are generally not recyclable. And so, this is also a key question around like the use of plastics and petrochemicals more broadly. So, often I think it's kind of almost easy to forget that plastics are made out of fossil fuels, where they're so ubiquitous in our society, but, also understanding, what are the roles of fossil fuel companies and petrochemical companies as well.
And I think that report said that the way to help this as an individual is just use less plastic so that we're not even putting it into the system. Is that?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that, when we're thinking of, ways that individuals can contribute to some of these like really broad societal questions. I mean, of course, there's questions around like your personal consumption and, always like using less, whether it's less plastic, driving less is always going to probably have a net positive. But at the end of the day, there's systems and companies that are largely responsible. So, if you get a plastic coffee cup at the store or going to the coffee shop, like it's not your fault. I think that's also a key piece, is that like it's great for people to take agency, but also understanding that really what we need as a society is to hold governments and companies responsible, whether those are fossil fuel companies, mining companies, and or other companies that are responsible for harms. And so some of the things that people get told a lot and aren't always like fun to hear, but around engaging with your local governments and companies. But I mean, to me, one of the things that I always recommend people do is like actually talking to their friends and family members when they learn things about like this, about like, oh, did you know about this issue, like
Yeah.
educating people, and I think people learn when it comes from people who they trust and they love, and so using that as an opportunity to really share with the people in your community around, this is what we should be knowing, and this is what as a group collectively we can do together.
I feel like a theme across this work is like that the system itself is what is creating a lot of these issues. It's like the protections that people are missing, or the lack of regulations, or the lack of sort of like regulations being followed, um, as opposed to, oh, okay, like me as an individual am using a coffee cup, I'm a horrible person and like I'm contributing to this. It's like, well, those people should be protected from this happening in the first place. Like, I think the environmental movement has done enough shaming, and I think it's a problem in the environmental movement, and emphasizing people's individual morals is not helpful. But yeah, I feel like your work is enforcing that the system is the problem in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think there's also like lots of like really helpful documentation investigations like supporting that too. So a couple of years ago, the Attorney General's Office of the State of California launched a huge investigation into fossil fuel and petrochemical companies, looking at their role in essentially disinformation about recycling. Is that by the companies who are making all these plastics at the same time were telling people it was their fault, for all this plastic waste, and that they had to recycle. Meanwhile, they were producing more and more and more. And so yeah, the Attorney General's reporting on this is quite helpful, and I think is another good resource if people are particularly interested in plastics and petrochemicals, and this piece of disinformation which we've heard a lot about around maybe Exxon, and knowledge of climate science and impacts of burning fossil fuels on the climate, but also like it was well documented with many of these companies internally around actually that these plastics they were creating were not recyclable. Meanwhile, they were going out and making it a public issue, not a
Yeah.
private company issue.
At the end of your talk at Climate Week, you were talking about the geopolitical implications of minerals, and like how we are hearing so much about Greenland, and like it was being used as kind of a bargaining chip with Ukraine. Could you talk about the geopolitical implications of minerals at large?
I think like during COVID with supply chain things, I think a lot of countries and companies really woke up to the fact that there were like a lot of global supply chains were concentrated in specific places. And so I would say in the last 5 years, there's been a broad panic around minerals for that reason, around concerns that, most of, the nickel, even though it's in Indonesia and processed in Indonesia, it's then exported to China, or that most of the cobalt in the world comes from DRC, from specific
Mm-hmm.
mines. And so I think one of the like key things, we're hearing about like rare earth metals, for example, all the time in the news, and they're used
Mm-hmm.
in magnets and things that are used in renewables. But I think part of it is this like ploy for power. I mean, a couple of things that I'm seeing that I'm pretty concerned about. One is just generally around the stockpiling of minerals is something that we're starting to hear more and more about, where countries are essentially, yeah, stock, like it sounds like stockpiling minerals, which means that you're doing all this extraction and those minerals aren't even being used in the short medium term. So I think that's quite concerning. And sometime there's been new policies adopted by the EU, and it seems like every other week by the Trump administration around minerals and mineral security. So the EU has the Critical Raw Materials Act that was passed a few years ago. And in part, it essentially makes it that more minerals will need to be mined within the European Union, and not overly dependent on any individual country for more than, say, 50%. So I think that's something that countries are using. The Trump administration has been pretty unabashed about using minerals as a bargaining chip. So both with Ukraine and the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, the Trump administration essentially negotiated minerals for military aid agreements, seeing that these minerals are really important. It's not only for renewable energy, which is generally my focus when I'm talking about transition minerals. I'm thinking of transition energy minerals, but also many of these minerals also have dual purposes or multi-purposes with defense industries and in other industries. So there's a lot of reasons why these minerals are wanted, and and yeah, I think they're becoming, more and more central to a lot of our kind of like growing industries as a globe, whether it's tech and transportation. So I expect it to be a continuing kind of global, issue. There's a few things I think, like on a positive minerals governance stance that are kind of in the works. One is like through the UNFCCC, there was a broad push at this last COP30 in Brazil to include language on minerals within, conversations around just transition. And while that like text didn't make it into the final draft, that even having minerals talked about at a climate conference was a, a really new thing, and something that was, positive moving forward. There's also been a proposal by the Colombian government to have an internationally binding agreement on kind of minerals governance and transparency and traceability. And so that's currently being, at the very early stages of negotiations under UNEA, the UN Environment Assembly.
I know that you're not necessarily focused on data centers, but it was a panel that I watched about how mineral extraction for data centers are going to be competing with the already strained mining industry. They're estimating that AI-centered data centers will need 1 million metric tons of copper by 2030, and that each EV is going to need like 4 times as much copper than a traditional car.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, minerals are a finite resource. And so, I think we're still at a place where there is, general, the price of, for example, nickel right now is quite low. And so, this issue around like competing resources maybe in 2025 isn't that much of an issue, but maybe in 2035 and 2050, these will be, like much more salient actual trade-offs around, do you have renewables, or do you have data centers? Are they used for military purposes or for cars? You need copper for transmission also. And so just understanding that, when you do have finite resources, at some point you might run out. And so, yeah, really important to understand, whether it's providing a societal benefit as well, and ensuring that it is, helping people and helping the climate.
Well, Bezos says that we can solve that by mining objects near Earth in space. So, luckily, that's going to solve all of our problems. We'll just mine what's out there in space.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge conversation also around deep sea mining that's happening, pretty actively. Um, I mean, there's been proposals to mine like the near shore areas off Guam and American Samoa. Which, under like in the human rights space, we use the precautionary principle. So if you are not sure what the impacts are going to be, then you shouldn't do it until you actually understand. So particularly with deep sea mining, where you have, potentially tremendous climate impacts if you're disturbing, natural carbon sinks. And sorry, there's a motorcycle go by. But if you're, disturbing natural carbon sinks, but also, if you're, having impacts on fisheries that particularly, small island developing states are dependent on, that it could be, the unforeseen consequences could be, far outweigh any sort of benefit of having those minerals.
I have to end on a positive note. How do you take care of yourself? How do you do this work that's really hard and really important?
No, great question, and something that's very important to me. For me, like being outside and in nature is like my number one thing that I do to take care of myself. Yeah, just this weekend I went bike packing on Catalina Island with friends, and I think having time to be really locked in and focused on work, but also like really prioritizing, turning your phone off and turning your computer off, and like going and being with the people, and doing the things that really fill your cup. Yeah, that's really important to me.
Personally, I feel that a lot of what keeps me uplifted is like being in community with other people and knowing that like the work that I am doing when it is hard is like important.
Yeah, I think
Hopefully.
if you just burn yourself out, then you stop working and stop helping the movement. And so understanding that, like these are really big issues, and none of us are going to solve it by ourselves. And I think it's easy to get really focused and want to solve it by ourselves, and knowing that, you need to take care of yourself in order to, stay in the movement and stay, being helpful to other people and to yourself.
Second question is, do you have any rays of light that you can share with us about the work that you have done and the changes that have been made?
Sometimes it goes both ways, where sometimes you feel like, oh, I'm working on these really big, heavy things, and it's, still the same impact all the time. And then, yeah, like I think it's really important to celebrate little victories. So, for example, a few things that, seemed like positive steps to me. One was that a major pension fund stopped funding a mining company that, had been featured in some of our reports around human rights impacts and impacts on
That's cool.
Indigenous people. So even though it's not shutting that project down, but it's showing that, global investors are really concerned. I think is a positive, and something to appreciate and to celebrate, and to, also take that momentum
Right.
to the next, to the next investor and the next company. One of my favorite victories that I have absolutely nothing to do with, but I just think it's like a really great story, and like I really want to embrace it. And maybe this is something that you and your followers can think about, is there was a story last year in 2024 where Hyundai, the car company, was going to be sourcing aluminum from a smelter in Indonesia that was powered with captive coal. And there's a movement called K-pop for climate that got hold of this, and essentially ran a huge campaign and got Hyundai to pull out of it because of the carbon emissions from burning all this, coal for the
Wow.
use in their car. So I think that,
Wow.
like, understanding that movements and even like
So
internet
cool.
based movements have a lot of power. And so yeah, again, I had absolutely nothing to do with that, but I think it was one of my like favorite recent kind of like weird obscure climate stories of just like K-poppers taking down some captive coal plants.
Wow. No
But yeah, I
kidding.
think, yeah, always like celebrating little victories too, and not just,
Yes.
always pushing for the next thing, but like taking a moment to
Yeah.
like stop, to celebrate, to appreciate the fact that you spent a year writing a report and it came out, is like, I think, a important thing, and being able to share it with people. Like, to me, like those are things that are, really meaningful. Getting to, share the report that I wrote with the communities that helped me do it.
Yeah, those reports are massive. I
They're
unfortunately
so
didn't read all
massive.
of them. Yeah, I didn't read the whole thing, but I did read the summaries.
I highly recommend the summaries.
Okay, last question is, how can folks out there help support your work?
Definitely recommend like reading the summaries and watching the videos of our reports. You can find them on our website, cri.org, sharing on social media, and, sharing with, if you have friends that work, at EV companies or tech companies, climate companies. I think, and asking them questions of like, where are these minerals coming from? Like, what are the impacts? Do who are the companies you're sourcing from? I think in a lot of the spaces in the climate field, we can get really locked in what we're doing. But I think taking a moment and taking a step back to understand the fact that, we're all really connected, and, these decisions that are, that we all make impact everyone else. And then lastly, yeah, I think whatever you can do to like share the stories of people who are directly impacted is really important. And so, highlighting always that, local communities are their own best experts, and know what's best. And so ensuring that, when you're talking to companies, when you're going to the dealer to buy a car, asking them where the minerals are coming from, and if they don't have an answer, like maybe that's a good sign to take your business elsewhere.
That's a good question to ask your dealer. Interesting.
They might not have the answer, but if
They
if
probably
people
won't.
keep asking them all the time, then they have a business interest in knowing that.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Krista. Everybody applaud. Everyone, they're applauding for you in the future.